She lied awake at night for 2 straight years, terrified that one missed jump shot could end her career. Not lose her a game. End her career. That's not an exaggeration. That's not a headline written for clicks. That's what Lexie Hull actually told the world happened inside her own head every single night, while nobody outside the Indiana Fever locker room had the slightest idea how close she was to falling apart. And here's the part that makes this story different from every other one you've seen about the Indiana Fever in the last 2 years. While the entire planet was watching Caitlin Clark rewrite basketball history in front of sold-out arenas, Lexie Hull was going through one of the most brutal, most hidden, most remarkable transformations anybody in the WNBA has experienced in the last decade. This is the story of a woman who almost got erased, who found her way back from the edge, and who finally decided to say out loud what it actually costs to survive inside the most scrutinized team in women's sports history. Stay with me, because by the end of this you're going to understand exactly why her story matters just as much as the one everybody already knows. Let's rewind to where it actually started, because you can't understand the weight of what Hull carried without understanding what she walked into. On draft night in 2022, everything about Lexie Hull looked perfect on paper. 6th overall pick, a Stanford graduate, a national champion, 3 All-Pac, 12 selections. The Elite 90 award, which only goes to the athlete who combines the highest academic performance with athletic excellence at the championship level. This was not a project. This was not a gamble. This was a polished, complete, credentialed prospect who looked like exactly the kind of player a franchise builds its future around. What the draft cameras didn't show you, what nobody talks about in the highlight reels, is what she was actually walking into. The Indiana Fever in 2022 were not just a struggling team. They were one of the worst franchises in the entire league. Losing seasons stacked on losing seasons. No playoff appearances. A culture that had been searching for its identity for years with no success. And if you want to know the hardest possible environment for a young professional athlete to grow up in, it's exactly that one. A team that is also fighting just to survive. Because in that kind of environment, every single game becomes an audition. Every missed shot becomes evidence against you. Every substitution feels like it's carrying the weight of your entire future. Now here are the numbers, and I want you to actually sit with these for a second instead of scrolling past them. Hull averaged fewer than 5 points per game across her first 2 professional seasons. A top 10 pick. A Stanford-educated player with a national championship on her resume. Fewer than 5 points a game. By her second season, she was logging more than 20 minutes a night on the floor and still couldn't consistently push past 4 to 6 points. Those aren't just disappointing numbers. Those are the kind of numbers that quietly end careers before the public even notices they started. But the stat sheet only tells you half of what was actually happening. The real story was happening inside her head, and athletes almost never talk about that part in honest terms. There's an entire culture in professional sports built around hiding fear, especially if you're still trying to prove you belong on the roster. So when Lexie Hull finally opened up about this in an interview with Glamour magazine, it hit different than the usual athlete talking points. She described a fear that went far beyond basketball. It wasn't about missing a shot in the moment. It was about survival. She was genuinely, seriously worried that one bad read, one blown possession, one wrong decision at the wrong moment could be the exact thing that got her cut from the roster completely. Picture that for a second. A Stanford graduate, a top 10 draft pick, lying awake at night, terrified that a single missed jumper could take away everything she had worked her entire life for. That's not garden variety nerves. That's the real, grinding, daily psychological weight of playing for a losing team with zero margin for error and no safety net underneath you. She called those years nerve-wracking in a way that reached way beyond the actual games. And here's why that matters so much. Losing cultures do something very specific to a player's mind. When there's no winning to smooth over the rough nights, when there's no playoff push to give the whole season meaning, every single individual mistake gets blown up in your head into something enormous. The stakes start to feel life or death even when, objectively, they're not. And for someone who was already quietly questioning whether she even belonged at this level, that environment was slowly and silently destroying her from the inside, in ways nobody watching from the outside could ever fully see. What made her honesty so remarkable wasn't just that she admitted it. It was how clearly she understood it. She could name exactly what had been happening to her. She could explain, in detail, how that pressure had worked its way into her mechanics, into her breathing, into her footwork, into her decision-making in real time, live, during actual games. That kind of self-awareness does not come easily to anyone, and it's exactly what set her up for what happened next, because everything around her was about to change completely and without warning. April 2024. The Indiana Fever select Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick. If you need the 2-second reminder of what that actually meant, here it is. Clark was the most prolific scorer in the history of NCAA basketball, men's or women's. For years at Iowa, she turned Big Ten women's basketball into a legitimate national television event on her own. She broke records that had stood for decades without being touched. She sold out arenas in cities that had never once shown up for women's college basketball before her. She turned the Iowa Hawkeyes into one of the most watched programs in all of college sports, regardless of gender. And the question hanging over her the second she stepped into the league was simple but massive. Was any of this real? Or was this a college phenomenon that pops the second she steps onto a professional court? The answer came fast, and it was unmistakable. Clark shattered WNBA records for fan engagement, for television viewership, and for rookie performance, records that made the old benchmarks look almost quaint by comparison. Overnight, the Indiana Fever went from the most forgotten team in the league to the most talked about, most controversial, most covered team in all of women's sports. Sold-out crowds, national broadcasts, a media circus following the team wherever they went. The entire league felt that shift, whether they wanted to admit it or not. But what mattered most to the players already on that roster was what was happening inside the lines. And for Lexie Hull, what Clark brought to the floor was something most casual fans completely missed. There's a specific kind of player who changes the game for everyone around her without needing to dominate the box score herself. Clark is obviously an elite scorer, sure, but according to the people who actually share the court with her, her most underrated gift is something much harder to measure. It's vision. It's her ability to read a defense 2-3 steps ahead of where the play is actually developing. Her instinct for pulling defensive attention and creating openings for teammates that appear almost faster than the defense can react to them. For Lexie Hull, that translated into something she hadn't experienced in 2 full professional seasons. Real, genuine, uncontested looks from the perimeter. Not the product of a broken play or a lucky rotation, but actual designed opportunities. She was suddenly getting the exact shots she had been draining in practice for years, shots she knew how to make, but had been too mentally locked up to hit consistently in live games. And the results were immediate and dramatic. Hull's three-point shooting percentage in 2024 hit 47.1%. That's not just a career best. That's one of the finest shooting seasons by anyone in the entire league that year. For context, her three-point percentage back at Stanford sat around 37%. She didn't just return to her college level. She blasted past it the moment the psychological weight of a losing culture stopped pressing down on every single shot she took. She described the shift in almost disarmingly simple terms. She knew the open looks were coming. She knew the work she had put in was real. So instead of gripping every attempt like it might be her last shot ever, she let herself live with the outcome. That kind of mental freedom is not something a shooting coach can hand you. It's not something a film session can manufacture. It comes from trust in your teammates, in the system, and eventually in yourself. Clark gave her the first 2. Hull had to find that third one entirely on her own. But the court was only half of what was changing. Off it, something just as unexpected was quietly developing. When Clark got drafted, there were real, legitimate concerns about how she would fit into a locker room full of players who had already spent years building relationships and a team identity together. She was walking in as the most famous player in the entire sport, the face of a franchise transformation, and the subject of more media attention than any WNBA player in recent memory. At Iowa, she had 4 years surrounded by teammates who had known her before all of this, before the records, before the national spotlight, before the impossible weight of expectation. Indiana was completely different. These were grown professionals with their own careers, their own paths, their own complicated feelings about what this moment meant for the league and for them personally. There was real worry in certain circles. Would the established players actually welcome her in? Would the massive gap in attention create resentment? Would the locker room even hold together under that kind of weight? What actually happened was the exact opposite of everyone's fear, and it started with Lexie Hull. The two clicked almost instantly, and not in the polished, PR-managed way that gets carefully staged for cameras. In the genuine, slightly chaotic way real friendships actually form. They were hanging out off the court around Indianapolis, trying cocktails together, filming content for TikTok. During the league's Olympic break, when players went on a group trip to Mexico, the two of them were inseparable in a way that people picked up on immediately. This wasn't manufactured. It was the real thing, and everyone around them could tell. By the time the 2025 season rolled around, that dynamic had grown into something with its own identity inside WNBA culture. Sophie Cunningham had been traded to Indiana in the offseason, and the three of them, Clark, Hull, and Cunningham, started calling themselves the Trace Locks. That trio quickly became one of the most entertaining, most genuinely likable presences in the entire league. They caddied together at an LPGA Pro AM. They roasted each other constantly online. Hull told People magazine that Clark could use some sun exposure, turning a set of Fever Media Day photos into one of the funniest off-season moments the league had seen in years. She posted about it on Instagram, needling Clark's famously pale complexion in a way that only works when two people are completely, genuinely comfortable with each other. And it went even further than jokes and photos. Hull confirmed, publicly, that Clark would be at her wedding. That wasn't a throwaway comment. Hull had gotten engaged in April 2025 to Will Matson, a former Stanford baseball player who had been drafted by an MLB team before a string of injuries forced him to walk away from the sport entirely. The two of them had met at Stanford, and after Hull got drafted and relocated to Indianapolis, Matson picked up his whole life and moved there to be with her. He gave up his own athletic career to build a life around hers, and now he was standing at the center of one of the biggest moments of her entire life, with Caitlin Clark set to be there for it. That is not a story built by a PR team. That's a real one. But even while all of this was unfolding in public, cheerful and easy and warm, Hull was quietly preparing to say something that would cut straight through every one of those feel-good headlines. She was getting ready to be honest in a way that most players in her exact position would have chosen to avoid completely. The 2025 season arrived with enormous expectations attached to it. Clark had just finished the most impactful rookie season the league had ever seen, and heading into year two, Hull described the difference in her as undeniable. There was a new seriousness to Clark's presence, a sharpness, a focus that told everyone around her she was done adjusting and ready to take over completely. Hull said before the season even started that it was obvious Clark had arrived ready to do business, and everyone on that roster could feel it. Through the first 7 games of that season, Hull was, by any reasonable measure, the best player on the entire team. She was leading the whole WNBA in three-point shooting percentage at over 55%. She was averaging more than 10 points a game. The Fever looked like a team that had taken the next real step, a genuinely cohesive unit with legitimate championship potential. And then the injuries started. Clark's quad went first, then her groin, then a soft tissue issue that knocked her out for another stretch entirely. By July 15th, she was dealing with her 4th separate physical setback in just a few months, this one coming during a game against the Connecticut Sun. And the image from that night became one of the defining pictures of the entire season. Clark, after giving absolutely everything she had, walked off the floor and sat down on the bench with a towel covering her face, her forehead resting against the basket support, looking like someone holding herself together through pure willpower alone. And sitting right next to her, not saying a word, just present, was Lexie Hull. Hull talked about that stretch afterward with a kind of honesty that felt deliberate. She described watching Clark go through the specific frustration that only hits you when your body refuses to cooperate with what your mind and your work ethic are demanding of it. This wasn't decline from a lack of effort. This was happening despite an almost superhuman amount of it. And Hull understood that distinction clearly, because she had lived through her own version of it. Despite losing Clark for huge stretches of the season, the Fever fought their way all the way to the WNBA semifinals. They took the eventual champion Las Vegas Aces to a Game 5 that went into overtime before Indiana's run finally came to an end. Hull's contribution to that entire run wasn't the kind of thing that fills up a highlight reel. She was locking down the best perimeter scorer on the other team, night after night. She was making the two-way plays that keep a game close when everything else around you is falling apart. She was being the player her team actually needed, instead of the player the cameras were most interested in filming. And she was doing all of it while carrying the emotional weight of watching her closest friend on that roster fight through one of the hardest stretches of her entire career. All of that was building toward a moment Hull had clearly been sitting with for a long time. In October 2025, Glamour magazine ran a Women of the Year feature that included Hull alongside some of the biggest names in entertainment and sports. It was a massive recognition for a player who had quietly become one of the most respected people in the entire league over the previous 2 seasons. Everybody expected the usual: a polished, athlete-friendly interview, a little backstory, some thoughts on the season, maybe a soundbite about friendship and growth. What actually happened was something completely different. Hull used that platform to say things players in her position almost never say publicly. She named the jealousy directly. She admitted that the media attention surrounding the Indiana Fever, the cameras, the sponsorships, the national broadcasts, the entire transformation of the franchise's profile had created real resentment from other corners of the league. She said it plainly. There was jealousy over what the Fever had become because of Caitlin Clark's presence, and it wasn't only coming from fans or media commentators. It was coming from inside other locker rooms. And then she went even further. She said the Fever had heard it themselves, directly, not through rumors or secondhand gossip. Players and teams from the other side of the league had said, out loud, that they could not allow Indiana to win. The target on their backs wasn't some metaphor. It was literal, and it was being said out loud by the exact people competing against them. Sit with what that actually means for a second. Every single game the Indiana Fever play, opponents treat like it has playoff stakes attached to it. Every matchup against Clark and her teammates carries an intensity way beyond a normal regular season game. Every referee call, every no call, every moment of physical contact gets filmed, dissected, argued over, and used as ammunition by people who have probably never sat courtside for a professional basketball game in their entire lives. And every player on that roster lives inside that pressure cooker every single night of the season. Lexie Hull had been living inside it for 2 straight years by the time she sat down for that interview. She'd watched it up close, in real time, from inside the most scrutinized team in the history of women's sports. She'd felt it in the body language of opponents on the court. She'd heard it directly from the people lined up across from her. And when she finally decided to talk about it publicly, she didn't frame it as a complaint or a grievance or a plea for sympathy. Her response was essentially, fine. Use it. If the extra motivation other teams feel when they play Indiana makes them show up harder and more prepared, then good. Everyone deserves to face the best version of their opponent. And the Fever believe they get exactly that every single night. Her attitude toward being the target wasn't resentment. It was acceptance, and even something close to welcome. That's a genuinely rare quality in a professional athlete, especially one who has every reason in the world to feel wronged by the circumstances around her. Step back now and look at the full shape of what Lexie Hull actually went through. She walked into the league as a genuinely gifted player on a franchise that was quietly collapsing. She spent 2 years fighting just to hold on to a roster spot, putting up numbers that had nothing to do with her actual ability, surviving inside a psychological environment that was slowly dismantling whatever confidence she'd arrived with. She was scared. She was struggling. And almost nobody outside those walls had any idea how bad it had actually gotten. Then the most disruptive force women's basketball has ever produced walked into that building and changed every single variable at once. The culture shifted. The franchise exploded in profile. And Hull's own game got freed from the mental prison it had been trapped inside for 2 years. She shot 47% from 3. She became a legitimate two-way contributor on a team that went from lottery-bound to semifinal contenders. She built one of the most genuine, visible friendships in the entire league. She became a household name in WNBA circles, not through marketing, not through a personal brand strategy, but through the completely unmanufactured combination of real performance and real personality. And she did all of it while being brutally honest about what it actually looked like from the inside. The fear in those early years. The freedom that came with playing next to a passer like Clark. The emotional weight of watching a close friend battle her own body through injury after injury. The reality of playing for a team that every single opponent treats as a personal enemy. She talked about every bit of it, not in the carefully managed, PR-crafted way athlete interviews usually get built, but in the direct, human, unfiltered way that actually resonates with people who are paying real attention. That's what separates her story from every other narrative orbiting Caitlin Clark's career right now. This was never a story about proximity to fame. It's a story about what you do with that proximity, whether you shrink from it or grow into it, whether you disappear into the noise or find your own voice inside the chaos. Lexie Hull found hers, and the fact that she found it inside one of the loudest, most intense environments women's sports has ever produced makes it considerably more interesting than it would have been under any quieter circumstances. So what happens next? Hull entered the 2025 offseason as a restricted free agent for the first time in her entire career, and that's a completely different kind of uncertainty than anything she's faced before. In her early years, the question was whether she'd even make the roster. Now the question is whether the team she helped rebuild into something real will find a way to keep her. The Fever hold the right to match any offer she receives from another franchise, and given everything she brought to the table in 2025, most people around the league expect Indiana to do whatever it takes to keep her in that jersey. But professional sports are rarely as clean as the logic of a situation suggests, and the WNBA's collective bargaining landscape adds real uncertainty into the mix. Hull herself has admitted she can't fully predict how it's all going to shake out. What she can speak to clearly is what Indianapolis has come to mean to her. Her fiancé relocated his entire life there for her. She's built relationships in that city that go far beyond a basketball contract. And the Fever fan base, which grew right alongside the team's transformation over the last 2 seasons, has become something she's openly said she loves. None of that guarantees anything. It rarely does in this business. But what it does guarantee is that wherever Lexie Hull ends up playing next, she's carrying something with her that no contract negotiation can ever take away. She knows exactly who she is as a player and as a person in a way she absolutely did not know when she walked into that building as a scared 6th overall pick back in 2022. She knows what she's capable of when the environment finally matches her talent. She knows how to be a real teammate instead of a performative one. She knows how to be honest about hard things in public without making it about herself. And she knows, maybe more clearly than almost anyone who's ever been in her position, exactly what it feels like to go from the edge of being forgotten to the center of the biggest story in women's basketball. That kind of knowledge is rare, and the way she's chosen to use it, generously, honestly, without the protective armor most athletes wrap around their most vulnerable truths, is exactly what makes Lexie Hull worth paying attention to long after the Caitlin Clark headlines have moved on to whatever comes next. Because this was never really about standing in someone else's shadow. It was about what she built in spite of it. And by every indication, she is just getting started.